In 1991, the most powerful communist state in history quietly collapsed, and the real cause was not war or politics, but decades of economic failure. The Soviet Union stretched across 11 time zones, commanded the largest military on earth, yet its own citizens could not find bread on grocery store shelves. Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. To understand why the Soviet Union fell, you have to go back to the very moment it was built, because the problems were built into its foundation from the start. In 1922, the Soviet Union was formed after years of revolution and civil war, built on the idea that the government would control every single part of the economy. This system was called central planning, and it meant that officials in Moscow decided what every factory would produce, what every worker would earn, and what every store would sell. On paper, this idea sounded powerful. A government so organized it could direct an entire nation like one giant machine, with every part perfectly synchronized. But running an economy like a machine ignores one enormous truth. And that truth is that millions of people do not behave like machine parts following perfect commands. In the early Soviet years, officials discovered very quickly that setting prices for thousands of different products across an enormous country was almost impossible to do accurately. By the 1930s, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin had taken full control, and his solution to every economic problem was simple: work harder, produce more, and never question the system. Stalin forced millions of farmers off their land and into collective farms, where the government owned everything and dictated exactly how much grain each farm had to produce. This forced collectivization caused one of the worst agricultural disasters in history, with harvests collapsing across Ukraine and other regions as the rigid system failed the land. Between 1932 and 1933, millions of people in Soviet territories lost their lives in a devastating famine that historians have documented and studied in careful detail for generations. Yet despite this enormous human cost, the Soviet government continued pushing its central planning model, convinced that control and force could build a strong industrial economy. And in some ways, it worked in the short term, because Soviet industrial output grew rapidly through the 1930s and 1940s as factories produced steel, coal, and military equipment. When World War II began, the Soviet industrial machine proved its strength, helping defeat Nazi Germany through sheer production volume as Soviet factories outbuilt their opponents. After the war, the Soviet Union emerged as one of two global superpowers, standing alongside the United States in a rivalry that would shape world history for decades. This rivalry was called the Cold War, and it cost both sides enormous sums of money, but the Soviet economy was far less equipped to sustain that level of spending. The United States had a market economy where private businesses competed and innovated, constantly finding new ways to produce goods more cheaply, more efficiently, and in greater variety. The Soviet Union had none of that natural competition, and without competition, there was no pressure to improve, no reward for efficiency, and no real reason to change anything. Soviet factory managers were given production quotas, meaning they had to produce a fixed number of goods each month, but the quality of those goods was rarely measured or rewarded. Factories produced goods nobody wanted, goods that were poorly made, goods that sat in warehouses while store shelves across the Soviet Union stayed completely empty. A famous example is the Soviet shoe industry, which once reported producing millions of pairs of shoes annually. Yet Soviet citizens still struggled to find shoes that actually fit them. The factories were making mostly one size because that was easiest to count toward their quota, showing exactly how the system rewarded numbers on paper over real human needs. This disconnect between official numbers and real life was quietly poisoning the Soviet economy from the inside, and almost no one in power was willing to acknowledge it openly. By the 1950s, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev stood before the world and made a bold promise, declaring that the Soviet Union would surpass the United States economically within a generation. Those words sounded confident, but behind the scenes, Soviet economists were already seeing alarming signs that the system was slowing down and running out of easy resources to exploit. Soviet economic growth had come largely from adding more workers, and more raw materials to its industries. But that approach only works when you have unlimited land, people, and resources. By the 1960s, the Soviet economy had used up its easiest labor reserves, and now desperately needed genuine innovation to keep growing. But the system did not encourage innovation. Innovation required freedom to experiment, to fail, to try new ideas, and none of those things were permitted inside the rigid Soviet command structure where every decision came from above. Scientists and engineers in the Soviet Union were brilliant, and this was proven when the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first satellite, into orbit in 1957, shocking the entire world. But that same brilliance could not fix empty grocery stores, could not solve the housing shortage, and could not make ordinary life better for millions of everyday Soviet citizens. The Soviet government spent heavily on defense and space programs, while ordinary consumer goods, things like refrigerators, televisions and cars, remained scarce and difficult for citizens to obtain. A Soviet family wanting to buy a car in the 1970s might wait 10 years or more between placing their order and finally receiving the vehicle they had paid for. This was not just inconvenience. It was a sign that the system could not meet the basic desires of its own people, and quietly, citizens were beginning to lose faith. Criticizing the government was extremely dangerous in Soviet society, so instead of speaking out, citizens learned to trade goods outside the official system in underground markets. This unofficial economy grew so large that historians estimate it accounted for as much as a quarter of all real economic activity inside the Soviet Union by the 1970s. That is a remarkable number. It means that ordinary people had already stopped trusting the official economy to meet their needs and had built an entire shadow economy to survive. Meanwhile, the Cold War was demanding more and more money from the Soviet state, with military spending estimated at around 15 to 20% of the entire national economic output. Compare that to the United States, where military spending was closer to 5 to 7% of output, and the enormous pressure on Soviet finances becomes very clear. While the United States could afford that defense spending because its market economy was growing and generating wealth, the Soviet economy was growing more slowly with every passing decade. Soviet economic growth rates, which had reached around 10% annually in the 1950s, had fallen to around 5% by the 1960s and continued dropping through the 1970s. Economists studying the Soviet Union could see the trend clearly, a system that had been slowing down for 30 years with no sign of recovering its early momentum. Then came the discovery of massive oil fields in Siberia, which gave the Soviet government a financial lifeline it would desperately depend on for the next 2 decades. Through the 1970s, global oil prices rose sharply, and Soviet oil exports poured billions of dollars into the government budget, temporarily masking the deep structural problems underneath. The Soviet leadership used that oil revenue not to reform the broken system, but to maintain the status quo, fund military expansion, and import food to cover domestic shortages. This decision proved to be one of the most consequential mistakes in Soviet history, because when oil prices eventually fell, there would be nothing left to fall back on. In 1979, Soviet forces entered Afghanistan, beginning a costly conflict that would drain the Soviet treasury for nearly a decade without achieving meaningful progress or victory. The Afghanistan conflict cost an estimated $50 billion over 10 years, a staggering burden for an economy already struggling to provide basic goods to its own citizens. While Soviet soldiers endured brutal conditions in the mountains of Afghanistan, their families at home were standing in long queues outside empty stores, waiting for bread and basic necessities. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power, and unlike his predecessors, he was willing to openly admit that the Soviet economic system was deeply broken and needed urgent repair. Gorbachev introduced a policy called glasnost, meaning openness, which gave Soviet citizens the freedom to speak more honestly about the very real problems they faced every day. The second reform was called perestroika, meaning restructuring, and it attempted to introduce limited market principles into the Soviet economy in the hope of reviving growth and efficiency. These reforms sounded promising, but they created an enormous unintended problem, because once Soviet citizens were allowed to speak freely, what they said was deeply critical of the entire system. Newspapers, once controlled by the government, now published accounts of food shortages, economic failures, and the growing gap between what was promised and what was real. The Soviet people had known these things for years, but seeing them printed openly for the first time made the dysfunction feel official, confirmed, and impossible to deny any longer. Meanwhile, perestroika was failing to achieve its goals because partial market reforms in a centrally planned economy created confusion rather than efficiency, and output in many industries began falling sharply. Factories did not know whether to follow government orders or market signals, workers lost direction, and the system began losing the coordination that had held it together. Many economists point to 1986 as the decisive moment, when global oil prices collapsed and the Soviet Union lost the last financial foundation it had been depending on for years. Oil had been selling for around $30 per barrel, but within months of 1986 it dropped below $10, cutting Soviet export revenue by roughly 50% overnight. For a government that had used oil money to cover decades of failure, the 1986 price collapse was a catastrophe that exposed the hollowness beneath the entire Soviet economic structure. At the same time that oil prices collapsed, the Soviet Union faced the devastating aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, which occurred in April 1986 in what is now Ukraine. The Chernobyl disaster cost the Soviet government an estimated 18 billion rubles in immediate response and cleanup, a massive financial hit on top of the already severe oil revenue crisis. Beyond the financial costs, Chernobyl revealed something even more damaging, showing the Soviet people that their government had been concealing the truth about its own failures for decades. The trust between Soviet citizens and their government, already weakened by decades of broken promises and shortages, now began to erode in a way that could not be easily repaired. By 1988, the Soviet economy was shrinking for the first time in decades. Industrial output was falling. Consumer goods were becoming even harder to find, and inflation was rising rapidly. The Soviet ruble was losing its value, and ordinary citizens who had saved their entire working lives were watching those savings become worth less with each passing month. Gorbachev found himself in an impossible position. His reforms had unleashed forces he could not control, and reversing them might cause the very collapse he was trying to prevent. Across the Soviet Union, the different republics that made up the country began demanding greater economic independence, sensing that Moscow no longer had the financial power to hold everything together. The Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania pushed for independence first, inspiring other Soviet republics to question their own relationship with Moscow and central control. What had once been a powerful empire held together by ideology, military force, and economic control was now visibly coming apart at its political and economic seams. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and Soviet satellite states across Eastern Europe broke free, declaring independence one after another in a matter of months that astonished the world. Each country that declared independence was one less source of economic resources for Moscow, and the financial pressure on the Soviet central government grew heavier with every departure. Senior Soviet officials attempted to remove Gorbachev in August 1991, but citizens took to the streets and the coup collapsed within 3 days, fatally weakening central authority. The failed coup signaled that the Soviet central government no longer had the power, the credibility, or the public trust needed to hold the Union together any longer. In the months that followed, republic after republic declared independence, and it became clear to everyone watching that the Soviet Union as a political entity had effectively ceased to function. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation, and the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, ending nearly 7 decades of communist rule. What replaced the Soviet Union was 15 newly independent nations, each facing the painful challenge of rebuilding their economies from nothing with no clear blueprint to follow. Russia entered the 1990s facing economic chaos, with inflation reaching over 2,000% annually at its peak and millions of citizens rapidly falling into severe poverty. The life savings of ordinary Russian families, built up over entire lifetimes of careful work, were wiped out almost completely as the value of the ruble collapsed to almost nothing. This was the true human cost of 7 decades of mismanagement, paid not by politicians, but by ordinary families who had no voice in any of these decisions. Almost every historian who has studied the Soviet collapse reaches the same conclusion. The system failed because it was built on a foundation that could not last indefinitely. Telling millions of people what to produce, what to earn, and what to think cannot build lasting prosperity, because that is not how human beings or economies actually work. Trust is an economic resource as vital as oil or steel, and once citizens stop believing in their government, even the most powerful system will eventually begin to crack. The Soviet story is a lesson about the limits of power, a reminder that no government, no matter how strong its army, can permanently defy economic reality. Economics does not respond to commands. It responds to incentives, information, and the countless individual decisions made every day by millions of ordinary people living their ordinary lives. That is something Moscow never fully understood, and that gap between their grand vision and economic reality was ultimately the space where the Soviet Union slowly came undone. The collapse of the Soviet Union did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It was the slow accumulation of choices, compromises, and ignored warnings made over many decades. Every quota rewarding quantity over quality. Every oil dollar spent on weapons instead of reform. Every silenced voice was another brick quietly removed from an already weakening wall. The Soviet flag came down on Christmas Day, 1991, but for millions of ordinary people, the real story was only just beginning, and it would be far harder than predicted. Within weeks of the collapse, the shelves that had been empty under communism did not suddenly fill up. Instead, they grew emptier as the fragile distribution system completely fell apart. The new Russian government, advised by foreign economists, launched a radical economic plan in January 1992, designed to rapidly transform the country from a planned economy to a market one. This plan was called shock therapy, and the name described exactly what it felt like. Because overnight the government removed all price controls and the cost of everything skyrocketed immediately. Bread that had cost a few kopecks suddenly cost hundreds of rubles, and families who had saved carefully for years found their savings could barely buy a single loaf. Russia experienced hyperinflation of over 2,500% in 1992 alone, one of the highest rates ever recorded in peacetime economic history anywhere in the world. To understand what that number means in real life, imagine that a product costing $10 in January costs $250 by the following December. For elderly citizens living on fixed pensions, this was devastating because their monthly income stayed the same, while every single thing they needed to survive became unaffordable, almost overnight. Across Russia and the other newly independent states, millions of people who had been considered middle class under the Soviet system suddenly found themselves living in genuine poverty. Doctors, engineers, teachers, and scientists, people who had spent their lives building careers in the Soviet system, watched their professions become nearly worthless in the new economic reality. A trained surgeon in 1992 Russia might earn less per month than a street vendor selling cigarettes, because markets reward demand, not the values that the Soviet state had prized. Meanwhile, a new and controversial process called Privatization was underway, which involved transferring state-owned factories, resources and businesses into private hands at extraordinary speed. Every Soviet citizen received a voucher worth 10,000 rubles, which was meant to represent their share of the national wealth that had been built by generations of Soviet workers. But with hyperinflation making the ruble nearly worthless and most citizens desperate for immediate cash, many people sold their vouchers for small amounts of money just to survive the month. A small group of well-connected individuals with access to capital, credit, and political connections bought up these vouchers and used them to acquire enormous industrial assets for almost nothing. In a matter of years, oil companies, metal industries, media organizations, and banks that had belonged to the entire Soviet people were now owned by a handful of private individuals. These individuals became known as oligarchs, and their sudden enormous wealth stood in painful contrast to the poverty spreading rapidly through the general population around them. Historians who have studied this period describe it as one of the largest and fastest transfers of wealth in recorded human history, happening in just a few turbulent years. While a few individuals became billionaires, life expectancy in Russia actually fell sharply through the 1990s, declining by several years as poverty, stress, and hardship took their toll. Russian male life expectancy dropped from around 64 years in 1990 to approximately 57 years by 1994, a collapse in human welfare that had few parallels outside of wartime conditions. In the streets of Moscow and other major cities, people who had once held respected professional positions could be seen selling personal belongings on pavements just to buy food. Retired military officers sold their medals, professors sold their books, scientists sold equipment, and the collapse did not distinguish between the powerful and the powerless in its impact. Beyond Russia, the other 14 newly independent nations faced their own versions of this chaos, each dealing with the same fundamental problem of rebuilding an economy from nothing. Ukraine, the second most populated former Soviet republic, experienced its own severe economic collapse through the 1990s, with its economy shrinking by more than 60% in a single decade. The Central Asian republics of Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and others found themselves without the financial support from Moscow they had depended on, and poverty reached levels that shocked international observers. Many of these nations had been kept economically dependent on Moscow by design, meaning they had never been allowed to build independently functioning economies of their own. The Soviet system had created a strange geographic trap, where factories in one republic depended on materials from another, and customers in a third, all routed through Moscow. When those connections were severed by independence, entire industries simply stopped functioning because the supply chains that had kept them alive for decades no longer existed as a single system. The economic pain after the Soviet collapse was so widespread because it was not just political change. It was the complete dismantling of an entire interconnected industrial world. Yet within this devastation, something remarkable was also happening, because in the wreckage of the old system, new ideas, new businesses, and new possibilities were beginning to emerge. Small private businesses began appearing on street corners and in converted apartments. People selling food, clothes, electronics, and services in ways that had been illegal just a few years before. For the first time in generations, people could start their own businesses, set their own prices, and keep the results of their work, and many embraced this new freedom passionately. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania moved quickly and decisively toward market economies, and their reforms were among the most successful transitions from communism in the entire region. Estonia in particular became a remarkable success story, rebuilding its economy so effectively that within a generation it had become one of the most digitally advanced nations on Earth. In Russia, recovery was far slower and more complicated, partly because the country was so large, and partly because its oil wealth made it tempting to avoid difficult structural reforms. When global oil prices rose again in the early 2000s, Russia experienced genuine growth and millions of citizens saw their living standards improve for the first time in years. Historians noticed a troubling pattern. Russia was once again depending on oil revenue rather than building a diverse, genuinely competitive economy from the ground up. This was the same mistake Soviet leaders had made in the 1970s. Raising a persistent question about whether the lessons of the collapse had truly been absorbed and learned. Looking back at the full arc of Soviet economic history, several clear patterns emerged that economists and historians have studied carefully to understand what went wrong and why. The first pattern is the danger of an economy that cannot receive honest feedback. When those running a system cannot hear what is going wrong, they cannot fix it. Soviet officials received reports showing impressive numbers, because the people sending those reports knew that bad news could mean punishment, so the bad news simply stopped being reported honestly. This is what economists call an information problem, and it is one reason why centrally planned economies consistently underperform market economies over any sufficiently long period of time. Prices in a market economy carry information, telling producers what people want and how urgently, and that signal system becomes irreplaceable once a government decides to remove it. The second pattern is the danger of resource dependency. The Soviet Union shows clearly what happens when a nation builds its entire national budget around a single commodity. Oil gave the Soviet government a cushion to avoid reform, and paradoxically, that same cushion became the reason meaningful reform was always postponed until it was too late. The third pattern is perhaps the most important: the deep connection between political freedom and economic health, two things that are far more linked than most people realize. In a society where criticism is dangerous, the economy loses access to the one thing it most needs to function well, which is honest information about what is actually happening. Soviet officials knew for decades the economy was failing, but speaking that truth openly was dangerous, so the truth was buried while the decline continued without being addressed. Economic problems left unspoken do not disappear. They compound, they grow, and eventually they reach a size where no government on earth has the power to contain them. The human beings caught inside the Soviet economic collapse had no special knowledge of these patterns. They were just ordinary people trying to survive an extraordinary set of circumstances. A grandmother in Moscow, watching her savings become worthless, was not a symbol or statistic. She was a real person who had worked for decades and deserved far better. A factory worker whose plant closed was not a data point. He was a father, a son, a person whose life was dismantled by economic forces entirely beyond his control. These human stories matter as much as any economic statistic, because history is not made of policies alone. It is made of individual lives lived inside those policies every day. What lessons can the world take from the Soviet economic story? And how relevant are those lessons to the economic challenges that nations continue to face in the present day? Any economic system that protects itself from honest criticism will eventually fail, because it cannot learn from its own mistakes, and that was exactly the Soviet fatal flaw. Prosperity built on a single resource, whether oil, minerals, or any other commodity, is always fragile, because the price of that resource is never permanently guaranteed to hold. The cost of economic mismanagement is always paid by the most vulnerable, the elderly, the poor, those with the least power to protect themselves from the decisions of others. When powerful governments make poor decisions and those decisions eventually collapse, it is never the decision makers who stand in the queue for bread. It is always ordinary people. There is a broader historical question worth considering. Why could so few people inside the Soviet system see the collapse coming, even as evidence appeared all around them? People who have built their entire lives around a system often find it psychologically very difficult to acknowledge that the system itself might be fundamentally and irreparably broken. Soviet economists who understood the system was failing often stayed silent, believing the next plan would work, that more time was all that was needed to fix everything, that hope, always deferred, always replaced by the next 5-year plan, kept the system stumbling forward long after honest analysis would have demanded urgent and fundamental change. Today, the former Soviet states occupy very different positions on the global economic stage, reflecting the different paths they chose and the different choices their governments made after independence. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and others that embraced open markets and rule of law achieved living standards by the early 2000s that would have been unimaginable under Soviet rule. Nations that moved more slowly on reform or that allowed resource wealth to substitute for institutional change found themselves trapped in familiar cycles of dependency that echoed the Soviet experience. The Soviet Union lasted 69 years, from 1922 to 1991, and in that time shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people across an enormous portion of the globe. Its legacy is not simple. It built schools, hospitals, and eliminated illiteracy across a vast country, but it did so at an enormous and deeply sustained human cost. The men and women who lived through the Soviet era and its collapse were witnesses to one of the most dramatic economic experiments in all of recorded human history. Their testimony, preserved in memoirs, interviews, and documentaries, consistently describes what it feels like to live inside a system that is slowly losing its ability to function. Witnesses describe it as a kind of creeping unreality, where something is clearly deeply wrong, but nobody around you is willing or permitted to say it clearly out loud. That feeling of knowing the truth but being unable to speak it was perhaps the defining psychological experience of life under the Soviet system for millions of its citizens. When Gorbachev finally opened the door to honest speech with glasnost, what came through was not just criticism. It was decades of carefully stored and quietly suppressed truth. That release of truth accelerated the very process Gorbachev had hoped to control, because some truths, once spoken openly, cannot be taken back, and the consequences cannot be avoided. The Soviet story ends not with a dramatic explosion, but with something quieter, a gradual recognition that 70 years of effort had created a result that could not last. The world watched a superpower dissolve, and in that dissolution it received one of the clearest and most carefully documented lessons about economics that any generation has ever been given. Economies are made of people, and people need honesty, freedom, and the ability to shape the conditions of their own lives. Remove those things and no economy can truly thrive. When we see nations today struggling with the gap between what governments promise and what citizens actually receive, the echo of the Soviet economic experience remains clearly audible. The Soviet Union is gone, but its questions about the relationship between power, economics, and human freedom remain among the most important any society can honestly examine. History does not repeat itself perfectly, but it carries patterns, and those patterns are there to be studied, understood, and applied to the decisions every generation must face. The people who lived through the Soviet collapse paid an enormous price for the lessons now written in history, and we honor them best by actually absorbing what they endured. The Soviet collapse was not a distant event. It was a human story about ignored truth and its cost, and stories like that one ultimately belong to all of us. The factories of Siberia now stand empty and rusting. The queues outside Moscow grocery stores are distant memories. But the lessons those images carry remain as relevant as ever. Every nation relying on a single commodity, every government silencing criticism, every system rewarding appearance over truth, is reading from the same old and very dangerous playbook. The cost of poor choices is never paid by those who made them. It is always carried by ordinary people who had no voice and no way to protect themselves. That truth is one of the central threads running through the entire Soviet story, from its confident beginning all the way to its quiet and deeply sobering end in 1991. We began with a paradox, the most powerful state in history collapsing not from outside force but from its own internal failure to serve the basic needs of its people. That paradox contains the full lesson of the Soviet Union, that power without accountability, control without honesty, and wealth without fairness will always in the end become their own undoing. The flag that flew over the Kremlin is now kept in archives, studied by scholars, and remembered by the millions of ordinary people who lived their lives beneath it. Their story, carried forward in documentaries, classrooms, and libraries around the world, is a reminder that history is never truly over. It is always speaking to us. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons, and I will help you discover them.